Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Architect's Purpose podcast. This is a discussion, a dialectic, if you will, into the true nature of what it means to be an architect in contemporary society. My name is Montgomery Borg, and during this series, I'll be speaking with my dad, Michael Borg. I'm an aspiring architect. He has been practicing for at least 3 decades now. So, without further ado, this week's podcast is all about The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. Here we go.
So I just figured to preface and before we actually get into it, as more of a structure for these, so we don't go too far off on any tangents. To try and keep it more structured, like the classes, and almost walk through what we all talked about. And I don't think we'll have to really give a full-on book report of the novel, but these books are also so known to us versus others who might have never even read them. But the overall purpose of this investigation and dialogue seems to be more about the abstract than what is the actual storyline, and
That's correct. I mean, we talk obtusively about the book in some respects. We talk specifically about some of the things that are covered, but we also talk about the principles and ideas behind it, and then again how it relates to practice. And that's
exactly.
that's the key. That's the important thing. Is you have a fictional character or a series of fictional characters created by Ayn Rand, and how do they actually relate to the practice of architecture? And I can even say that when we were talking about Brunelleschi's dome yesterday, it was how the practice has even changed when I started to how it is today. So, I mean, there's even that layer that's very interesting.
Exactly. And then how it'll really change as machine learning begins to take over. Welcome, and I am pretty excited for these really series of conversations to really put something down in writing or on recording, because also he speaks so often and so much that we can speak for hours, and it'll go in many different directions. And for me also, I can't always write everything you tell me down, and so I can actually go back and see, okay, look up these 4 people that I haven't heard of or have forgotten of by now, and I'm pretty sure he made up one of those, but I'm not sure.
No, I
But
don't ever make it. I don't ever make up people or things.
yeah,
That's somebody else,
exactly. But I'm typically like 1 or 2 scotches in, and I can't always recall the
Well,
entirety of the
I think I'm on
conversation.
number 4 here, so I'm
Yeah.
pretty lucid right now.
Cheers. And so I felt this podcast would be aptly called The Architect's Purpose, in that we're really trying to search for the nature of what it really means to be an architect in this ever-changing society, and how technology and mob think and just the overall philosophical changes, how that both impacts architecture and also impacts society as a whole, because they're basically almost one, because society inhabits, what we build, and these books will be reviewing on the first being the Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, and they're all aimed at really trying to analyze these world-class or fictional, architects, and I was wondering from your class, what was the main takeaway or the main jumping off point that they really grabbed onto?
I don't know if there was a main jumping off point. There was a series of questions that I asked them, one of which was the distinction between, so Ayn Rand writes these characters that are um, incredibly definitive, and um, and so if you look at Richard Keating versus Howard Roark, one of the questions I posed to the students was, is there inherent, what are the inherent differences between the two, right? Um, and their responses were, quite varied, but it was an interesting discussion because Ayn Rand, you know, pits these two as diametrically opposed characters. And we all know that the reality of human beings is that they're not quite that pure. They're not quite that um, uh, distinctive. That there's bits and pieces of Howard Roark in some of us, and there's probably bits and pieces of Richard Keating in us. And so, what does that mean? As we look at the practice of architecture, we think about the practice of architecture. One of the questions I posed to them was that, well, so if you think about Richard Keating, what was his motivation for what he was doing?
Mm-hmm.
And it was, he wanted to be popular. He wanted to be well known. He sought the
Exactly.
he sought the admiration of society, and he did it in a way that he wasn't individualistic about it. He had to ask people and seek people's approval about things that before he formed an opinion of him about something himself. Um, he was doing the populist thing.
Mm-hmm.
He was giving the people what they wanted, and of course, Howard Roark was the opposite of that. He knew internally what he wanted, how he wanted to do things, and it didn't matter whether society approved it or not. It was something that he had to personally achieve and pursue as an individual. And so those are the two very clear distinctions that were set up. And so I asked the students, how they felt about that.
Mm-hmm.
Is it, and so one of the characterizations about Howard Roark was when he was, well, one of the questions I asked was, under what terms did Howard Roark agree to work for Richard Keating? And it was, he agreed to do that if he didn't do any design. He said,
Exactly.
I'll go out to the field, I'll do structural drawings, but I don't want to design because I don't want to design to the masses. I don't want to do what you're doing because for me,
Exactly.
it's failing myself, and it's going against my personal ethics, my personal beliefs.
And I think throughout the book, she really questions: are people willing to really compromise their values for notoriety or fame, or and essentially not stick to a rigid individualist school of thought, but that doesn't even mean that one is unchanging, but it's also what do you value? Is it all of the likes and all of the admiration, or is it that real self-worth and self-esteem and that true independence from others? Or do you really need everyone else out there and live as a second-hander?
So I think that that's the crux of the situation. That, when I was asking the students, I said, well, what if a client comes to you and says, I want you to build me a Tudor house? Are you going to turn them down? I mean, if you need the job, you need the money, is there something inherently wrong about doing what the client wants? And Howard Roark clearly makes the statement of, I have clients so I can build, not I build so you know, you know, the reason I have clients is so I can do the buildings I want to do, not the other way
Exactly.
around. I'm not doing what the client wishes. And,
Yeah.
and clearly Richard Keating was doing whatever the clients wanted. And so the question I asked them was that, as a value statement, is it wrong to do what your clients want? It's a tough
Yeah.
question, right?
Because it's at one point it's tough to discuss without the actual details, but then on the flip side, it's absolutely important to have the details be completely irrelevant, because it seems it's way more on the nature of the building, and it's part of also the hubris of the hubris and the reality that these clients, if they could do it themselves, then they would just not hire you. So there has to be that element of either differentiation, but more
Well, no,
importantly,
that's not
I think
true.
improvement.
They
What do you mean?
client So some clients hire you because they already have an idea of what they want. They just need somebody with a stamp and a seal and a license to execute it. So if you made a shit ton of money doing that, is there something wrong with that? Um, and so I related a couple of stories. One, when I was, many years ago as a younger architect, I was working for a practice where one of the principals in the firm, it was a woman, and was doing, she did these circuit cities all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, and she just cranked them out. And I think she made like 80% profit on all of them. Um, but yet, at the end of the day, she went home. She didn't, she wasn't waking up in the middle of the night worried about this or that. She did her job. It was a 9 to 5 deal. She went home at the end of the day and got a good night's sleep and came into the office the next day. Whereas we were working on other projects that, required, a lot more individual attention to them. And so we were staying up, all hours of the night and cranking through things, and, waking up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night thinking about a project. And so my question to my students was what she did wrong? What's the value proposition there? Or what's the value? Is there a right and wrong about it? Well, no, she loved what she did. She was
Yeah.
providing a service to the clients. And, it may not be something that I want to do, but for her, it was the right thing. It was something that she really enjoyed doing. And so there are different levels of achieving something in the profession of architecture. And you just have to find your own path. Another story I related was that, there was a young woman who was in graduate school with me who was very talented, but at the end of her graduate school, she wanted to go back to Iowa and just do these rural, regional kinds of projects that were
Mm-hmm.
meaningful for her community, but they weren't going to put her on the cover of Architecture Record.
Mm-hmm.
And and so, did she, the question is, did she compromise her faith in architecture by doing that? Some would say yes, but at the same time, she was honest about what she wanted to do and true to her own
Exactly.
faith about it. And in some ways, she was
Exactly.
probably more committed to the role of Howard Roark than people who do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So that's the quandary. That's the interesting thing. That's the interesting dialogue that we got into in discussing the book, is trying to assess good and evil. Is there is Howard Roark all good and Keating all evil? Well, I think Keating is not evil necessarily, but he was willing to not cling to a set of values himself, and was always changing with the current taste, the current feeling, whatever society wanted, he was giving them. And I think that when you abandon your convictions, there's something inherently bad about that or wrong about that.
Yeah. It seems, especially in those two stories, and it's all throughout the Fountainhead as well, just that element of true self awareness and what really drives you. And in the book, she definitely argues that at least Roark's happier and Keating ends up pretty miserable. And there's a very interesting dialogue between Wynand and Roark when he's asking him basically what drives him, and it's an interesting dialogue because they both already kind of know the answer to the question, but how Roark ends up explaining how at at various times he was broke, had zero pork at all. He was hated, but he didn't really care at all. He was, I mean, even whenever he was pretty much starving, it was way more about his inner self, not compromising to the earthly pleasures of being admired or what have you. And I feel she definitely tries to argue good and evil. I don't.
But I think it's good and evil, not about it's about, again, following your passions. It's about being honest
Yeah.
about those pursuits. And and so yeah, she does argue good and evil, but it's not necessarily the fact that Keating was giving the clients what they wanted. It was the fact that he was abandoning his own personal principles. And I think that's the difference. And again, you see that in Atlas Shrugged with
Mm-hmm.
the characters that she writes in that book as well. And so whatever your values are, whatever your principles are, whatever you're passionate about, you either stick to it or you abandon it. And once you start to compromise that, then you start moving from the good side to the evil side, from the light to the dark. And I think that that's really what she's arguing.
And I feel that crux of that argument is also really spelled out whenever Keating is finally paid partner, Prankon retires, it's just him, and he has a blank piece of paper. And he's like, what do I do?
What do I do now? Right.
And he calls Roark, and Roark designs the Cosmos Slotnick building, and then he's all over the papers for it, and it's just quite interesting on if you don't have that foundation, whenever you do have that freedom, it's like, well, here's a blank page. What are the values that you start with? And if you're alone in a room without any input, what are you going to do?
Right. Yeah, and I related to my students as well. As I said, I've been in a position where, as my predilections are toward high modernism, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, that's the arena in which I like to practice. But I have been asked by clients to do things that are, hyper traditional, and
Mm-hmm.
I have told both my clients and my colleagues and my students that I feel like I can design anything. Just
Mm-hmm.
give me the parameters and and if I have to, and I was actually excited about doing the research of uh, looking at the work of McKim Eden White and really studying it deeply and understanding
Exactly.
that, and then trying to apply that to a project. So
Exactly.
there's something that I was passionate about in emulating um, a I don't want to necessarily call it a style, but emulating an era in architecture that I mean, I studied McKim Eden White both as an undergraduate and a graduate in my postgraduate work too. That it's if you diagram it, some of the work that they did, like the University Club in New York, is a brilliant building. I mean, it's got the cortile
Mm-hmm.
in the center of it. It stacks very nicely. It's very proportional. As a planning exercise, whether or not you like the facade from the traditional aspects of it, the planning of it is brilliant and beautiful and elegant. And so you can't just say that the work of McKimmey and White should be slid aside because it's not Corbusier. There are aspects that you obviously can learn from every different era in architecture, and you hold on to it. And so if you have a client that comes to you and says, I really want a traditional building, do you walk away from it? If you're Howard Roark, you probably would. And if you're Keating, you would say, well, I'll do this for you. And if you're Michael Borg, you say, well, I want to learn how to do this kind of building because I really don't do it all that much, and I want to
Exactly.
experience this. And you're not compromising your values because you only see the world in one way. You're
Yeah.
looking at it as an exercise to deliver something at the very highest level, highest quality. Just
Exactly.
stylistically, you're doing it differently than what your own individual predilections are. So are you saying that you're compromising yourself as an architect to do that? And so I threw that out at the students. Let's have a discussion about that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And it all seems to quite depend on how you go about that neoclassicism or neo whatever, and to truly pay homage and do it appropriately versus what's really spelled out in the book and the movie of it's a hodgepodge with a BS facade with pie or just with everything being quite out of scale and just thrown on there versus it actually being erected out of the ground and really being
Well, but I think the
historical.
difference there is so Rem Koolhaas said that the skyscrapers in New York were were fascinating because they were they had they had great bases and they had elongated trunks and really interesting tops, and they didn't really work because they were trying to be something that should have only been 5 stories, and they were trying to
Mm,
make and so what I'm talking about is a client coming to me and not asking me to do a 50-story building that looks like a McKimmey and White building. I'm talking about something that is a 3-story building or 4-story building
yeah,
that is emulating that kind of art, stylistic architecture.
yeah,
And and I'm totally okay of doing that, but to try to do that on a 50-story building, I would tell the client, no, that's not appropriate.
yeah.
And I probably would walk away from a commission like that.
Because at a certain sense, it's basically an Italian palazzo that's been stretched up, and
Right.
that's not the point of all of those proportions. It seems pretty that Roark is pushing these forms and structures where a lot of what we see even today are these just plain extrusions because that's the cheapest and you can people buy it, and puts that responsibility on the architect because if it's not on the architect, it's obvious it's never going to be on the clients or the contractors or the city because it just hasn't happened. So I feel it has to be on the architect
It
to,
is,
yeah.
but I would argue that if you look at Mises Seagram's building in New York,
Mm-hmm.
that um, or even the project study he did in Chicago, the you know those large seemingly faceless buildings have a very public sensibility about it.
Mm-hmm.
Along Fifth Avenue, he pulled the building back and created
Mm-hmm.
two giant fountains in a public space that is inhabited by people all the time. And so
Mm-hmm.
you could say that the skin of the building was just plain and banal and just ran up 40 stories, and which is true, but he created an environment, he created a public space, and an active public space by stepping the building back and placing it instead of along the street edge. He created a respite within the volume of the city. And from
Exactly.
an urban point of view, he really understood that, and how he built that building. And so I don't think that the plainness of those facades is a detriment to it. It's actually it's a very elegant project. It's a very elegant facade. It is
Mm-hmm.
the it's the it's the people, the copiers, that didn't understand his insightfulness in how he went about his architecture, that followed him and created really bad examples of it. Um,
Yeah, and because also the sleekness and the proportions are not something to really be taken all that lightly. And if you do something kind of similar, as in like basically putting I-beams on the facade, but it's this gigantic building that takes up an entire block, and then boom, it hits the ground with no relief. Or like, there's plenty of those kinds of examples out there, and I as I mean, I really applaud Peace for that gift of public space, because especially walking through Manhattan, how many real plazas and parks in the traditional sense are there? And
Very few.
yeah, like,
And the
and
buildings come
even
down and they crush the ground, and they
exactly,
I've always said that it was the imitators that really hurt modernism, and that's why the public and the world and even architecture responded to that, because modernism's failures, because of all these bad imitators, really pushed us into a postmodernist era for 20 years,
yeah,
because we were trying to recall some of the beauty and elegance of the Beaux-Arts and the Renaissance, and so some of those buildings. But you know unfortunately, that was even uh, you know that was even worse, because it was pastiche, it was wallpaper, it wasn't
yeah,
real, it
exactly,
didn't hold space in the same way. And even those some of those buildings have really lasted the test of time. We even had, again, bad imitators of postmodernism that really created crappy buildings out there. So it's the bad architects that are giving architecture a bad name.
yeah,
It's the cheap imitators. It's not the people who are truly doing innovation. And
and it's uh-huh.
I always struggled with so Ayn Rand had always, or she never said it, but people felt like she was writing a book about Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah,
And
I did get that sense a lot through it, especially in learning how he was completely dissed by Philip Johnson and all of them. Like
well, it wasn't
absolutely
that.
dissed.
It was, so his mantra, or the Lloyd Wright mantra, was truth against the world, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so and and that is easily translated to Howard Roark's mentality. It's like, I know what I want to do. This is what I believe in, and I don't care what the world says. It's my truth against the world. Um, and but I also felt like, she was writing a little bit about Mies as well,
Yeah.
because even though he didn't have the same mantra as that, he certainly had uh, the work that he was doing and visually described in her book was, for me, more Miesian than Wrightian.
Yeah. Because Bright was um, quite the one for texture and tone, and quite the interior designer, and using all different kinds of materials. Where Mies, he was like, okay, this is what's current and modern and new, and why would I build out of stone or brick or anything else? It's like glass and steel is clean, and especially chrome steel. It's like it's very, very clean. And also what he was doing, not just from the aesthetic standpoint, but from the columns from the column systems and the overall play of space, and basically opening it up free of walls. And that wasn't explicitly him, but I mean, he was in that era and improvements. And it was, I did also feel that the way she was describing Roark's architecture was also both, yeah. And even some of Corb. But as I've learned about the whole movement of the intellectual style, I mean the international style, and how it was almost about aesthetics as well, because why else would they leave out Frank Lloyd Wright? I mean, kind of generationally, because he wasn't quite as young, but still he was very well known, had a hell of an ego, and that also probably played some into it. But I don't know. I felt she did a great job of combining a lot of different aspects of them versus, oh yeah, I'm reading a Frank Lloyd Wright talk off. and
Right.
um and because also in the book she really talks about like a house and a skyscraper and a
So, like,
storefront,
Heller's
and on and
house,
on. Yeah,
sounded like it was Frank Lloyd Wright,
yeah.
but the oh, the what was the first high rise?
Cosmos Slotnick, or
No,
the
Cosmos Slotnick, actually Keating did.
the core
Um,
the
no,
chord building.
yeah, well, that was one of them. But the high rises that that Rourke did in New York were clear, in my mind, clearly Miesian.
Mm-hmm.
But the
Clean,
houses that
yeah,
he did early on were very Frank Lloyd Wrightish.
yeah.
Almost recalling things like Falling Water, um, and so I think it was interesting because she collaged this character of Howard Rourke by several different architects, and I found that to be interesting, even though I think his mantra, "Truth against the world," really played to Howard Rourke's sensibility all through the book.
And also just the myth that Frank Lloyd Wright has become. He's been this very extreme individualist, and like he drew everything himself, they say. And and all of this very, very quick, intuitive design, even though it's actually quite ornamental as well. He was, I think, almost like the ultimate kind of arts and crafts architect, because he was able to really blend the modernism and the old and give it a feel more than something cold, you know?
Well, I think Frank Lloyd Wright, uh, he moved across a lot of different stylistic sensibilities. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
the the arts and crafts movement was, at its height during, his popularity. And even though he
Exactly.
didn't emulate that, the fact that, he created these molds for his bricks to be put on, several of the California houses that we've
Yeah.
seen together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that was one part of it. And then the fact that, part of his, and, if you, part of his doing of Falling Water is, creating modern architecture almost better than some of the, Gropius and Brewer and some of the other architects that were doing it at the time, right? So
Mm-hmm.
he had the ability to, operate across a whole series of different aesthetic movements at the time, and truly understand, or try to understand, if you think about it beyond style, but if you think about him incorporating modern materials and the open plan, and the fact
Mm-hmm.
that he was probably more popular in Europe than he was in the international style folks and the Europeans. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they loved his work, and they studied his plans, and if you look at how he did, how he developed the Prairie House and how he did the Usonian House as a prototype, you actually see Mies's work in the Barcelona Pavilion in that.
Hmm.
Uh,
How
and
so?
because what Wright did is he built a design of a house around the hearth that was the center of
Mm.
the home, and then all of the walls extended beyond that. They extended out into the landscape, which is
Yeah.
very much like, in principle, the Barcelona Pavilion that
Mm-hmm.
Mies did. And even though it didn't
Hmm.
really have a fireplace or a hearth, there was still a center to that composition. And then all of the walls and pieces extended out into the landscape. And if you take the gabled roof, or the hip gable roof that Wright did, if you just take that part off, if you look at the Roby house from underneath, where the extension of the soffit, you can see the Barcelona Pavilion.
Hmm.
If you don't look at the shape of the roof and you just see that plane coming
Yeah.
out, it's the Barcelona Pavilion. And and so
Fascinating.
and they had they had access to his portfolio. It's the Wasmuth. I can't remember the exact name of it.
I'm not sure.
Um, but he produced this portfolio that was a series of plates of his earlier housework, and I think
Mm-hmm.
it's either called Wasmuth, Wasmath. Uh, it was the first portfolio, and it went to Europe, and it was like wildly popular. I mean, it was studied by Gropius, it was studied by Mies, it was studied by all these European architects, and they were amazed and fascinated by the quality of the work. And yes, it had perspectives and elevations, but it was really the plans that had them captivated.
And I think and feel that's something that is often overlooked, especially today. It's all about the pretty form and the shape and what's it look like from the outside versus what's the actual function and use of it. And in that, the question is, what's the real efficiency of the plan? And a lot of times it's terrible just because it looks cool on the outside. And I can't give any better example than the cube house housing project in Rotterdam, where it looks cool. It's a cube on its side. It's bright yellow. It's up over a street, So, but when you get inside, it's a cube turned on its side, so all the volumes are off. And literally in one hallway, it has a corner sticking out, and it turns like a 4 foot hallway basically in half. So I have to like squeeze past this corner thing, and it's like it makes no sense at all. And you can easily get tossed in there because all of the doors look identical, even the door to the stairway. So you can end up like walking into someone else's room on accident because it's because also it's Europe and it's not all clearly marked, or it's in
Dutch, so like it's not quite as easy. But I just feel that today, that plan and that real analysis of it, because it should start with the plan, because that's how you move through the space, and that's how you. I mean, I feel you can also start with the section as well, but I feel with the plan, it's just how we actually are able to move and operate in it versus, oh, this is a cool parametric spiraling form thing. And it's like, yeah, it is cool, but like, what's the overall, like, how real different is that from a box or something in plan?
So if you go back to the late 50s, when you had a conflagration of brilliant minds all studying at or all teaching at the University of Texas. So you had Colin Rowe, you had Hayduck, you had forget the dean at Syracuse, but you had these great intellectual minds that were all trying to reach tenure track in Texas, and they didn't get it, and so they all dispersed to mostly the Northeast, and they ended up a number of them at Cornell. And so the Cornell school of thought is the plan, the plan, the plan. If the plan is right, everything else falls into place. It's not about creating these ziti forms on the outside of the building, but it's really diving and making sure that the plan works, because that's the experiential part of architecture. And so there's a certain aspect of architecture that makes sense. But then I'll throw this out. If you look at one of the most intriguing buildings that I find that troubles me, and it makes me fascinated, is the Casa Musica by Koolhaas. And it's this warped cube that has a series of very different kinds of spaces. And so it is experiential architecture. And the way he designed it was a journey through the building. And it had I think, 2 performance halls in it. But it's a journey to the building where you end up at the end of the journey on top of the building overlooking the city. So it's this, it looks like this alien craft, that just landed in the middle of a medieval city. So the form on the outside looks very perverse, if you look at how it fits into the city. And even if you think about the plan from a conventional point of view, the spaces are ill understood as you move through it. But as you take this journey through the building, you enter the building, you go through the lobby, you go into the performance space, you come out, on top to the practice rooms, and you end up on the very top of the building overlooking the city. That was the purpose of the building, was to create a journey through these different kinds of spaces. And so, and I think Koolhaas is very good about creating those kinds of spaces, compression spaces, open spaces, even confusing spaces. So I hear what you're saying about the plan, but then I think about a building like that, and truly that was more about the section.
Yeah.
It's not a core building. It's not a niche building. It is very much, true to the architecture that Koolhaas has been pursuing for, his whole career. But it's really one of the more fascinating buildings that he's done, because I really I don't find it to be an attractive building from the outside, but I find it to be a fascinating building when you talk about how you move through the spaces and the kinds of spaces that you encounter when you're in it.
Spot on. And I think Koolhaas is just the master of doing weird but intellectually deep buildings and spaces and forms. And there's one also, I believe it's the Dutch embassy in Germany, but I could be mistaken. But it's a cube and then an outer wall also, and the outer wall is all of the surfaces, and in the cube, it's that same kind of journey up through it, and that many times there are these framed views of the true monuments around the city, and to really give you that sense of okay, yeah, I'm in this building, but I can see that steeple or this tower or what have you. And I'm blanking on where that explicitly is, but there's this great drawing of its plan, and he basically unspirals it, and it's this one long plan, but in reality, it has all of these turns, and it basically corkscrews up to the top. And I think there's a roof garden, if I'm not mistaken. But and I think that's a space we can get into, especially today, in thinking about plan and sections simultaneously in the creation of spaces, without being such a slave to one or the other. Because in plan, how do you really get the feel of the space? I feel the plan's more of the organization, and the section is that feel and that full experience of, oh, it's actually a sloping roof or whatever, and it seems it'll be we're kind of doing it through modeling, but that's more building volumetrically than thinking about it in spatial terms like section and plan, and but it'll be interesting if we can have even more in-depth programs that can operate on I mean, I feel Previt also is both basically at the same time, but it's still thinking about it 3D versus almost like a 2D section, if that makes sense. But I don't know, it seems, especially going forward, we're basically gonna be writing a script saying, hey, these are all of the needs and the parameters for this plan or this building, and it'll be like, here it is. I mean, I think that's kind of, or here's all of the different options and here's the most efficient, but all of that still comes down to what's that proper input data, and is all of that accurate, and or especially continuously updated. And it just it's quite interesting to me how, even though we build all these buildings, especially the architects, it's like, okay, it's built, I'm done, and then they don't really ever go back and look at it or collect data. The only one I can think of offhand, and I'm sure there's more today, but the New York Times building by Prince of Piano, how it actually intakes some data to try and regulate its overall light usage. But beyond that, it's like, well, could we actually analyze how efficient this factory is being in with a computer versus by hand, and in uh, 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 or insert any program here, that I feel we're thought that will be out of a job, but the job's definitely changing again. Just how you went through analog to digital, I think we'll experience that digital to the overused term of AI. And be interesting to see how that goes, which is why I've really been trying to learn some elements of coding, and to try and marry those two versus having to draw everything by hand, essentially.
Well, I think there's going to be an aspect of that, certainly, that, the buildings that you see that are, plopped along a highway that are, intended for, that are developer driven. You're going to
Mm-hmm.
see the analytics of those go to something of, well, here's the most efficient skin, here's the percentage of glass to a solid, to help maximize the cost. you're going to see the AI analytics of those things, crank those buildings out almost perfunctory.
Mm-hmm.
But and there's going to be a need for some of that, continuing, or probably a lot of that continuing. But I think it's the other kinds of buildings. It's the buildings that where people aren't just going for a few hours and then going home. It's the buildings that create places and spaces. It's the museums and the mixed use projects and the creation of community that you can't always do. You need the analytics to help manage constructability and cost and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I've said all to you probably more than once, is that there was a brilliance about what Corb did, which was creating something that was absolutely rational, and within every one of those rational things there was something that was unexpected, and you look at it and go, holy shit, how did he come up with that curve, or
Mm-hmm.
how did he come up with that roof, or how did he come up with that space? And so when he said that the architect was the pure marriage between engineer and artist, he played on both of those sensibilities. He played on the engineering sensibility and he played on the artistic sensibility. And he did more so on the artistic sensibility later on in his career, because he had mastered the engineering side of it. And so he had allowed him to play more artistically. But I think in every building that has meaning, there's always something unexpected in it. That even if it's hyper rational to almost everybody who walks in, there's something that is, something that is impulsive, something that is personal, something that comes from the gut versus the head.
Yeah.
That says this is the way it should be, because it's going to make it different and interesting and resonate with a certain character.
And
all the best buildings do all have that. They really do.
And it seems also, especially because this is almost a strictly modern phenomenon, but they're able to pull it off because they almost set up a rigorous ideology or a rigorous pattern, and then when it's able to be broken, that's when people, I think, recognize it more, versus it just all being super crazy, and then people can hate it. I don't know.
So Stravinsky wrote a book called The Poetics of Music that is a short little book that you probably should read at some point. And he talked a little bit about this, that the compositions that in music that we hear, that really, for lack of a better term, resonate with us, are the things that have a certain pattern that is deliberate and intentional. And it's when those patterns are broken in music that you recognize it as something astonishing, something new, something that remains with you. And I think visually we do the same thing, that there are certain patterns that we see, and when those patterns are broken, those are the things that are memorable about it. And so when I talk about the rationality of Corb, it's those moments where he was irrational and artistic that create something very memorable about the buildings that he's done. And you can track that really through, name a famous architect that you really like. You can see that in their work as well.
And then you almost hit to the craziness of today, and I put the two in like the most formal craziness, probably Gary and Tom Bain, because I don't feel Roark is as free with the form. I feel he actually sticks a lot to the patterns or the very simple moves they make, and that's kind of it. Where Porphosis is just an entire composition in the building, and you almost kind of don't know where to begin the eye, and it just tracks and it tracks, and it isn't just about that formal beauty. So especially with Morphosis, they push a lot of different technologies and pretty programmatic ideas beyond, oh, this is pretty, I hope people like it. A lot of the things they do from the facades and so forth are very intentional, and they come from that technology or from that overarching idea. And I don't know, it seems that today there's a lot of shock value, and with just all of these very pretty images, and a lot of times the renderings don't look anything like the actual thing, like we saw with the new Texas Ranger Stadium, how the renderings don't look that bad. Like, I was pretty pumped, and then like it's so dull looking, especially the proof. But like, I've been with people and we've tripping past it, and they've said it's pretty cool, and I'm just quiet, because I'm like, I don't want to
Yeah.
just like roast it, but like, I mean, it's a brand new stadium, and that's a feat in itself. But just in looking at what was promised and then what's delivered, it's like, well, we had to cut some costs somewhere, even though the form is basically the same. And that happens almost too often. And then that comes back to, how much should the architect stick to that original agreed upon drawing? Because something that's important about Roark in the Fountainhead is, he isn't necessarily, I'm going to design it exactly how I want to, but as long as you agree to the first set of drawings, which I feel it phrased that way, is there's a little bit of a conversation, at least, because he has to know what kind of house, how many buildings, or like, he has to know something, and then once they agree, then there isn't any nitpicky changes, or, oh, we'll save you 37 cents a doorknob or something, and I'm sure you've had those probably very mind-numbing conversations.
I
Oh,
had one today, as a matter of fact.
oh, really? Over what? just
Yeah, it was
oh my.
so I'm doing a multifamily project in Carrollton, and it's you're arguing over um, the cost of what it costs per square foot for sod, or what it costs per square foot of crushed granite, or what it costs per square foot of steel in this certain area. And oh, if we substitute this material out, it'll save us, you know, 30 cents a square foot. Like, well, yeah, but it's going to change the whole look of it. So no, we're not going to agree
Yeah.
to that. So
and
yeah, it's every day is a fight. Um,
and so that fight is mostly with the contractor pleading with the client to save any money possible, essentially, which really means the contractor earning more money. Like, it seems that's the argument.
well,
Does
it's not
it?
necessarily that cut and dry. It's,
No.
the client is saying, this is what my budget is. The
Mm,
contractor's trying to work to get down to that budget. Um, the costs for anything, seem very fungible and malleable, and the costs that were yesterday are all of a sudden different today. One of the things that we found out, because it's a multifamily building, and so
mm-hmm.
there's a great deal of wood construction for it. It's 2 floors of concrete and 4 floors of wood construction on top of it. Well, the
Mm-hmm.
price of wood now in the COVID era is at a 6-year high. And so
Wow.
so when the contractor first started pricing the job 4 months ago, they had, X amount for all of the wood framing. that is necessary to build a building. And
Yeah.
now just the delta between 4 months ago and today is $1.1 million. Yeah. And so all of a sudden, through no fault of anybody's, because Lowe's and Home Depot went out and bought all this wood because everybody's doing their home projects because they're staying at home.
Yeah.
There's a spike on a material that you would have no idea that. So we had a project that was in budget. Now it's $2 million over budget because of one material, because of one issue. And so how do you combat that? And so you have to, dig deep and try to find other ways of saving the project money in order to get it built the way you envision it being built without compromising the overall quality of it. And it's through no fault of anybody's. I mean, it's not the fault of the contractor necessarily.
Huh.
It's not the fault of the architect, certainly. But those are the realities of dealing with it. And I've told you over and over again, it is so damn hard to get anything built because it's a fight from day one, whether it's an unexpected spike in prices or whether it's the fact that some subcontractor is really greedy and is gilding his prices beyond what should be normal.
Mm-hmm.
It's a deliberate, all out fight to get something built the way you envision it, and you have to make the right decisions on it.
Yeah, and it seems like there are plenty of times, yeah, we could change that door and knob or footing or that flooring or what have you, but it seems that you can only really know through doing a lot of them and being involved with a lot of them to know at what point does it really compromise everything. Because a question I was going to have is it easier of a process if you can do design build and you are the contractor as well, assuming you can do it efficiently and properly. But it seems that it's so up to the market. I mean, the reason Bilbao is titanium is because titanium dropped and whatever covering he would have had on it went up, and
Right.
it's like, okay,
Well, he
titanium it
was going to
is.
do it out of stone originally, but
Oh, really? It was going to be
yeah,
stone? I don't.
yeah.
I that's. I actually kind of want to see that because is it just like a stone veneer essentially,
Yeah, of
or
course it is. Yeah.
okay? Because I don't know. I was thinking something a lot thicker because it's stone, but still to get double curved stone, you just have to carve it, I guess. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
but that means each piece is super well, but that's also how he operates, and
Yeah.
like I will design the program in which I will design everything. That's just like a level I'm trying to ascend to of not even being reliant on Rhino or SketchUp or Brevit or any of these things that do have their own limitations because they also are so in depth as well, that breaking it down to what is more the essence versus just adding on and on seems to be a trick more so than it being all kinds of overwhelming or just beyond even necessary at times. Um, but it's so back to the book. I, I really feel she pushes all of these characters into these extreme parts or these extreme roles where but all of us are pretty a part of all of them. And how can we more so recognize that in ourselves more than trying to be so judgy of that's a terrible architect or that's a terrible person. It's like, well, I think once you are already doing that and putting yourself on a pedestal comparing even to others, then it's already lost.
Well, I would agree. I mean, I think that I think the underlying principle between all for all of the characters is to be, true and honest about about your nature, about your desires, about the things that are important to you, and not to compromise those or not to manipulate others into it. So if you look at the character of Tui, he was all about, manipulating things for, his own ends.
To
And,
take
there's some,
souls, literally.
yeah, so there's something, obviously inherently wrong because he didn't let people, I mean, he wasn't being honest about his true character, his true nature. Um, for him, it was all about manipulation and control, and creating a society that he thought was the right one, um, versus, Dominique or Roark or Winan, any one of those that were, so Winan, I think, is an interesting character. So he gave the people what they wanted through the banner, right? But ultimately, he understood and recognized. I mean, he knew who he was deep down inside, and he allowed for these activities for him to make money in order to be able to pursue the things that he felt was really important. And you could call that immoral, perhaps, or you could call that him being, again, honest and true to himself. Um, because ultimately, I think that he was a character very much like Rourke, um, in the sense that he was an individualist. He knew what he wanted. He just used other means, um, to pursue that, where Rourke, only used a singular means to pursue what he thought was true about himself. Um,
Exactly. It seems that Winan is way more Machiavellian, and in that Tui is also, but I feel Proarch is more giving the people what they want in order to be able to wield that power, and so he might not be compromising what's true to himself, but he's compromising any sense of what the nature of truth is, because truth is just what they tell you versus it being something very concrete. And I mean, especially if we're speaking about something like aesthetics or beauty, yeah, it can get subjective, but in just flat out reporting the news, it seems they were quite slanted and they pick and chose winners and losers. I mean, Tui also, like, the biggest slight he could have had against Proarch is actually not mentioning him at all, and he doesn't even mention him
right.
until I think it's I forget if he attacks him over the Stoddard Temple or if it's at the end whenever it's over the housing project. I think he goes after him for the Stoddard Temple.
No, he didn't go
It's the
after him.
housing.
It's the
Okay,
housing because the Stoddard
Dominique went after him. Yeah.
well, but they both went after him for very
Hmm.
different reasons. And so that was,
Yeah.
again, one of the questions I asked my students was, so why would Dominique and Tui join forces, and what were the motivations behind that? And they were, in some ways they were similar, but in other ways they were obviously very different. So Dominique went after Rourke because, in the same way that she threw the Greek statue down the air shaft, she felt like the world wouldn't appreciate Rourke and his genius.
Exactly.
And so I want to prevent them from destroying him. And so I'm going to take him out in order for, because the world just won't appreciate it. Where Tui did it because he wanted a different kind of world. And he also recognized that the world wouldn't appreciate Rourke, but he wanted everybody, um, to he wanted to even the playing field. He wanted everybody to have a say in what is good and right, instead of
Exactly.
those people who actually understand what is good and right with respect to architecture or design. And he wanted the masses to drive that debate and that discussion. And I hesitate to even call it elitist, because I you know I don't think um,
It's almost anti-elitism.
well, right. I mean, that's
You
certainly
know?
was Tui's perspective, but um, you uh, he came from I think a sensibility that, well, I don't know if that's true. I was going to say he came from a sensibility that everybody has a right to um, agree about beauty or not beauty, and and everybody has a say so in that, and everybody's opinion should be recognized and appreciated. Um, and where Rourke just internally knew what he felt like was right, and with regard, not right, but he Rourke internally felt he knew eh, the kinds of things that he wanted to pursue, and he didn't want to compromise on that. And he wasn't necessarily calling them beautiful, or I'm better than you are. He's just saying, this is the way I'm going to live my life.
Yeah.
And what Tui wanted to do was um, minimize that individual genius, and again put the description, or the how people would relate to beauty. He wanted to make that available to the masses. So then you have to ask the question: is that right? Is that correct? Is that you know I believe that everybody should have an opinion about what they feel like is beautiful or not beautiful. Um, but at the same time, I think there are a few people that can truly determine what that is. And is that elitist to say that? Probably. I don't know.
But it's also, what's the motive of the people who are determining what that is, because it's for sure spelled out in the book that Tubi's doing it for plain malicious reasons, and like other egoic type reasons, but not egoic in this. I mean, actually, in more altruistic reasons of, okay, we're going to open it up to everyone, and anyone can basically be an architect or a painter or anything. It just depends on if I say that they are. And I think if the intent, it's a tough pro. I think if the intent is more trying to praise that degree of overall self-awareness versus trying to impose an ideology, because only certain people fit into any ideology, and then the others are cast out or killed or what have you. And that determines, I think, the maliciousness. But I don't know, if I'm out there trying to give everyone a voice, it makes them post, since kind of it becomes to a consensus of what's good, but then everyone's going to be worried about what everyone else thinks. It's just after the Heller House Roark gets a commission. I'm blanking on the name, but that person actually calls Dominique and says, "Oh, I saw what you wrote about that house. Is it really bad? Is it actually awful?" And she steers him away from Roark to Keating, and I don't know. It's just that whole question of intent. Dominique is for sure very layered in why she's trying to cause destruction, and the book argues she's good, even though it
Yeah.
has the same result as Tui, which is just mind blowing. and just like she
Yeah,
is
so
good,
one of
but
my questions to my students was, what the hell's going on with Roark and Dominique? I mean, what a complicated, unsettling relationship that is.
very
So,
unsettling.
so I was trying to, going back to Tui for a minute. I always, again, keep in mind, it might be better explained in terms of Atlas Shrugged. So when
Mm-hmm.
Reardon created his, ingenious manufacturing of steel to create
Mm-hmm.
these railroads that surpassed anything that existed, they convene a committee to undermine his invention and try to give access to other manufacturers of steel, saying it was unfair that one individual came up with this idea that should be available to everybody, so
Exactly.
that other people can benefit from this invention in the same way that, so if you relate that to people's opinion about beauty and art and architecture, that's what Tu was trying to do. He was trying to take away from the individual genius and put it in the hands of the masses, that everybody should have access and everybody should have the same understanding about beauty and art and architecture. And that's just not true. I mean, everybody has their own individual talents. The thing that is argued in Atlas Shrugged is that you had a brilliant engineer who created a steel formula. You had a brilliant musician. You had a brilliant artist. You had a brilliant banker. You had all of these
Mm-hmm.
people that had specialized expertise, that they rose above their peers because they had that individual genius. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what society in Atlas Shrugged, what society tried to do was take away from that individual genius and give it back into the hands of everybody else, so it evened the playing field. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
Tui was trying to do with with the artistic sensibility, or people's opinions about architecture. Is he was trying to take away from the individual genius that existed in Roark and give it back to the masses, to say, well, the masses should determine what's beautiful, not an individual. And uh, and and so if you say that no, it really should be the individual that determines what is beautiful, is that an elitist point of view? And I kind of struggle with that a little bit. Uh, Part of me says yes, absolutely, because not everybody's created equally. Some people are really good at skateboarding, and some people are really good at designing buildings, and some people are really good at hockey. Um, but you don't want a hockey player making a determination on, what painting should be hung in the museum,
Yeah, exactly.
um, because their skill set is perhaps beyond that. Not to say that any hockey player couldn't also be a brilliant
Yeah,
artist as
yeah.
well.
But also, like, we don't try and play fetch with our cats. It isn't in their nature to really play fetch or do something really that a dog would. So why are all of these standards uh, uh, applied absolutely ubiquitously and with a blanket when everyone else is so, like, I don't think it's that elitist to call for more individualism, because also the masses, or that mob think, isn't just about everyone, and it's about, okay, a group of 10 people, or a group of 100, or a group of 4, and it's like 3 agree. Is that fourth going to speak out? Or a group of 12, like in a jury, is that one person going to stand there and speak their mind, saying, no, I actually don't think that they're that guilty, or what have you. And that conviction in those moments is why the individual is so important, because we've seen throughout, especially this past century and a half, how pernicious and how brutal absolute groupthink can be, to the point you are turning in family members of crimes that never even committed, because they'll do the same to you, and it's like them before me, and then it ends up happening to you anyway. and
Right.
it's like that's obviously farther down the slope, but that's on the slope, and if you aren't standing up for that individual, because also one thing I come down to in the idea of individual versus collective is, what is our conscious experience? That's as an individual. I don't experience it as a collective. On certain elements, I too, but in the ways that people speak about a collective, it's basically an aggregation of statistics. And statistics never tell the whole picture of, like, well, what's their cost of living? Are they buying enough bread? Or are they happy? These sorts of metrics are often incomplete.
Well, they tell the
And
what, not the why.
exactly. And the why is something I feel Ayn Rand really pushed through, even though these people in her book probably haven't ever existed in life, but they're such extremes that they're inside of us. And we all have a certain dynamic of Tui, of Keating, of Roark, of Dominique, and obviously Winand, and these needs to try and be more like Roark when you're really feeling like Keating, and just, but there is for certain that balance, because you have to understand that past as well and all of that precedent, because as I've heard you say, I don't know how many times, there's really nothing new under the sun, and you can waste a lot of time not doing research and like
Right.
doing so, and especially today, like I'm trying to think when you were in school and had to do research, that was like, okay, I have to go find a book, I have to go find it on the shelf, and then, I mean, I did look at a ton of books in school too, but it was way more for like visual stimuli versus like I have to find out about Corp or something, and
Yeah,
just
I had to go get to the card catalog and then go, yeah, find some obscure book on some shelf where the
hopefully it's
card
there.
catalog told me. Yeah, and sometimes it wasn't, and sometimes it was. Um, yeah, to try to even find a magazine article, you had to go. There was a special reference for magazine articles that you had to
Mm-hmm.
look up, and so you couldn't just go to, you know, a section in the magazine area of the library. You had to go
Oh,
to a
really?
reference book and look up, what you hoped it was the right reference for that magazine article, and then go and try to find that somewhere in the library afterwards. So it was always a two-step process. It was, um, and it was, yeah, it was really difficult. I know that I've told you this story before, and I love telling it because I find it so fascinating. So
Uh-huh.
when my professor in grad school, he was bemoaning the advent of the Xerox copy machine, and he was just, and I said, well, why was that such a problem? And he said, today, I mean, obviously it's even different now than it was 35 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, he said that, students now go into the library, they look up the plan of Shark Cathedral, they open the book up, they slap it on the copier, and they have a copy of Shark Cathedral. He said,
Mm-hmm.
when I went to school, there wasn't the Xerox copy machine. So you had to go to the library, find the book, take a piece of tracing paper, roll it out across the book, and trace the plan. And he said there was something magical that happened
Yeah.
when you did that, because all of a sudden you understood the proportions, relationships, the axes that were set up, um, uh, and all of the different elements that created that plan. You just couldn't you didn't have a Xerox copy of it. You actually drew it, and it became part of you in the drawing of it. And
Exactly.
and so
Um.
that story's always stuck with me because I've always said that there's something wonderful that happens in the hand-eye coordination of doing a sketch and continuing to sketch and draw by hand.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the computer is a wonderful tool. To me, it's a big electronic pencil,
Mm-hmm.
and should be thought of it in that way. It's just another tool in your toolbox, but it shouldn't be the only tool that drives design. You've got to be able to imagine it in your head and be able to for it to come out, through a sketch in your sketchbook, to then be translated into something digital. And so, that whole experience of doing research and looking up things, it was even shortcut, from when I did it,
Mm-hmm.
compared to what my professors had to do. So
Yeah,
even
exactly.
today with, oh, well, let's just ask Google. Google knows everything. Um, it's, you short circuit that process as well, I think. Yet another uh, step away from the reality of integrated learning, is,
Exactly.
just looking something up and seeing something digitally on a screen versus even in a book, even having the
Yeah.
Xerox copy of it, um, let alone hand drawing it.
Yeah, and I really found those hand-drawn precedent studies that we did in school early on. I feel we should have done a little bit more, but it really gave you a sense, because also almost all these plans were exclusively modern, so there's a lot more complexity than here's the Parthenon. I mean, like, that's very straightforward, or even all of these churches, the plan's very straightforward. But with the implementation of modernism, that actually, that real ability to draw it out and to really feel how others also drew it as well, and you get a real sense of that spatial and proportional relationships, rather than it being just printed or looked up, and things things reveal themselves to you as it's being drawn out, that you maybe didn't even quite see beforehand. And whenever I did my first precedent drawing, I actually did not have a pencil sharpener, and so whenever I had a desk crit, my professor just sat down, and it was McDonald, and it just, like, as he's sitting down, I can hear the huff, like, coming. He's just like, and yeah. So, who were your last two professors? And I told him, and he just like, get a sharpener, and he just like, he was there like 8 seconds. I was like, oh no, I got roasted without even being told anything terrible. But it was for sure an awful feeling. And then the next time, in like 2 days after, I had a very clean, or clean for me anyway, a very clean drawing, because I had these joint lines that were basically looking like load-bearing walls. It was just not good at all. And I found great value in that. And I also plugged out because I only had a 2-story building, where my friend Juan next to me, he had a 5-story building. And so he had to do 5 different plates where I just had 2. And it was really just 1.5. But I feel that need for precedent learning is important, but it's how do you balance that with the pro-arc in you of, okay, this is what's been done. How can you propel off of that into something new? But
Well, it's not just what's been done, but it's understanding what's been done. So,
and
if you
why?
look at, if you go back to, towards new architecture, in the chapter
Mm-hmm.
that deals with regulating lines, it's all about the analysis and study, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
uh, is maison gauche? Is that a double square? Is it is it a golden section? And then, are the windows themselves, are they positioned also a golden section from the ground? And Are they, are they evenly divided across the facade? And so it's the analysis of that.
Mhm.
And, I remember doing a number of those analysis, both as an undergrad and a graduate student, for, different architects that, I think I had to do the Michael Graves Hanselman house,
Mhm. Mhm.
which was which is one of his more modern, it was before he really kind of jumped into figurative architecture and
Mhm.
doing a lot of postmodern work. And, from an analysis point of view, both in plan and in section and in elevation, it's a brilliant project. And all of a sudden you think, well, he just didn't, invent this shit. He actually deliberately thought about the proportions of everything, the windows, the openings,
Exactly.
whether you were entering on the edge, whether you were entering on center, or just off of center. Um, and so, all of that was really thoughtfully done and executed. And it's a wonderful house to study. And there were a whole series of, we did Maison Garche and, Villa Savoie. I mean, I think we did
Mhm.
several, two or three core projects. We did a Meyer project. Um, I think we did one of all of the whites. We did probably a Guafi
Oh, really?
project and a Graves project. And so, yeah, it was just illuminating to know that at least at one point in the careers of some of these current architects, more famous architects, not Core, because obviously he was dead, long dead, but that they just didn't make this stuff up. It was purposeful, it was deliberate, and intentional, and it actually gave you a sense of awe about their work, and to
Mhm.
think, well, they're well known now for a reason. This is where they started. They've evolved from that, but they were really doing something, interesting and beautiful and unique. Uh, and so, yeah, I enjoyed that part of it, and I didn't feel like I was going backwards in doing it. I felt like I was understanding architecture better by looking at
Exactly.
those precedents and looking at those examples.
And did you do that in undergrad or grad school?
Both.
Both. Okay.
Yeah.
Because it's all that balance of really understanding why they did all these things, and it isn't even about moving on from the past as well. It seems like it's that attempt to also bring it with you and to show all of these really brilliant ideas or themes or what have you that have been lost on the average person or lost in contemporary society or what have you.
And I think it's not, to me, I feel like it's not taught enough. I remember sitting on a jury at University of Florida. It was a senior jury. It was probably 3 years ago, and
Mm-hmm.
their project that they were presenting, it's their final project, was uh, religious edifice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it didn't necessarily need to be Catholic or Christian or Muslim or whatever. It was just it was a spiritual edifice. And so, with that, and it was, set um, uh, in an area that was, close to Gainesville, Florida, but it, set kind of in the woods. And so, when the students were describing their project, I mean, for some reason, I just started honing in on the issue of, um, a proportional system. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I kept coming back to it, because for me,
Did they bring it up?
no, I did. So for
Okay.
me, if you're doing an office building, there's a certain, you do an office building, and the floor to floor height is specific, because there's a certain efficiency to that. You don't build
Mm-hmm.
an office building floor that's 20 feet high, because you have a lot of wasted space there. It doesn't need to be that high. but you also don't do a floor to floor height of 10 feet because that's too low. And so there's a
Mm-hmm.
certain, and you don't do it necessarily based on proportions. You do it based on, what what the efficiency of it and how the world deals with it. When you're talking about a religious edifice, there are no rules associated with that. And
Mm-hmm.
so I kept coming back to the fact, well, how did you, like, this one guy had this really narrow, long and thin, that if you were to set up pews, it would probably be, if there was a center aisle, there would probably be seats for, two people on each side of the aisle. I mean, it was just this really long, thin thing.
It's
And I
weird.
said, well, it's an interesting building. You've designed something that looks attractive. How did you determine how wide to make it? Was there anything driving you to do that? And they looked at me very confused. I said, well, did you do it based on, the height of the building as it relates to the width of the building? Did you do it based on a double square? Did you use a golden section? How did you determine this? Did you do any research on proportionality and how it relates to spirituality?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the work, of, and it's been well documented, the villas of Alberti and how they are, mathematically organized based on musical principles. And
Exactly.
so, and even brought that up. I said, is there anything in here that, you know, is, did you just do this by gut and feel? And do you think that that's the right way to approach something that has spiritual significance, or should it be related to something higher, something more important? And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why I just honed in on that, but it seemed like because there was nothing from a financial or efficiency point of view with the building type. Again, if you do a hospital floor to floor, is different. This, if you do an office building floor plate, there's a certain size that's kind of the right, in the sweet spot of how you would do a development for a basic office building.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you should ultimately understand what some of those rules are. But if you look at it from a regulating the lines point of view, you can probably throw those rules out the window because it doesn't, it's based on an economic model more than it is on something that's different than that. Whereas a religious edifice is not based on an economical model. It's based on potentially something higher, something more important. And I almost got into a knockdown, drag out fight with one of these students over this because they just didn't
Should have
get it.
filmed it.
Yeah,
Really? Oh.
they just didn't get the fact that when you're doing something, that is, beyond just the pure economics of building a certain type of building, um, you've got to have a higher reasoning other than, yeah, I wanted to make it long and skinny. Okay, well, why?
Yeah.
What's driving that decision? Please give me something. Um, and many of them were unable to address that at all, and it was very disturbing. I mean, I found that the whole exercise very disturbing.
Yeah, unfortunately, I found a lot of that why lacking in a lot of the projects I saw throughout school, and it was also because at times it wasn't really questioned by the professor as well. And I don't know, there's a thought out there that are way more on that gut feel and is it cool or is it aesthetically pleasant, but that's like trying to do finger painting and have it come out Picasso, just like like yeah, you can maybe get there, but if you don't have that compositional element and that idea behind it, and driving up, oh, I'm actually placing the eyes and ears over here, and it's flipped, and and just having some sort of idea of composition and program or something, um, because at times, yeah, it can look cool, but then at times it can be also difficult. And then, are you a sculptor or are you an architect? Like
Right.
it seems architecture is way, like, as much as it is the physical, um I mean, the um, the medium that all of us actually experience is not the actual true form of it, but the space that it leaves. And that sort of arrangement of those spaces is something that must be the question, I think. Way, like, and then everything I think else kind of falls in line after, from economics to technology to structure, on and on. But the spaces seem like the most crucial in the potential to rearrange them into something we haven't quite experienced before.
Well, absolutely. And again, it's what's driving those decisions. And so if you go back to the discussion we were having earlier about analyzing, some of these projects, some of these precedents, and discovering, wow, that they set the roof line because it was 1.5 times the width of the building,
Mm-hmm.
and not because they had to set it at 1.5 times, but it just proportionally looks better that way, and that in at some point that was a deliberate decision by the architect to do that, to create this beautiful building. and
Mm-hmm.
and there are reasons why, and the reasons why you can analyze it is because they were deliberate in their process about making these kinds of decisions. And so that's what I was honing in on the students, is the fact that, yeah, you should always have, probably some arbitrariness and some artistic movement, within your building that is perhaps unexplainable, but 90% of all your other decisions should be very, very deliberate and purposeful. And
Exactly.
so I want to see that part first. I want you to explain it to me in ways that I can understand, based on your concept and based on your partie and based on your big idea. You know, walk me through that process and then show me the really cool stuff where you broke the rules for that.
Because also, like, how often can you show a client a picture of something cool and then not say anything and just like mic drop and they buy it? It seems like they're always gonna have questions, like,
Of course they are. Yeah.
you know, especially cost and timeline, and is it actually gonna look like the rendering? But I really like how the course is set up, and how it moves from the Fountainhead right into Brunelleschi, and really that first hard-nosed architect and really an engineer as well, in understanding not only the design but that entire process of how it gets built. And I'm I've started printing it some, but all finished by this weekend, and I'm I'm pumped over that as well. And I
Well, my
just
students have already started drawing analogies between the Fountainhead and Brunelleschi,
exactly
or the rivalry between Gilberti and Brunelleschi. Um,
exactly
so
exactly
it's already been an interesting discussion.
yeah. And one thing, whenever I took the class, we kind of lost the Fountainhead comparisons after a few books. Partly because there's so much content, but it'd be nice to almost deliberately, like, almost reinforce those extremes, because especially by the time we got to Gary, we were kind of talking about them, but not really. Like, that was more because it was the last book and it wrapped everything up. But especially leading up to it, we didn't really discuss. But I think it's quite pertinent, especially in books like The Odd Couple and so on. Where it actually plays on two different competing sources. But I really look forward to speaking next time also. And I mean,
All
I
right.
too feel we can speak for pretty much ever, and
Yeah.
going on almost 2 hours is probably
Oh, is that
a
really? We've been 2 hours? Wow.
yeah 1:45, and then it was about like 10 minutes or so beforehand, and I mean I've really enjoyed this, and I feel we can even keep going, but it would also venture into other topics of of discussion as well, and I feel all these books really build on each other, and they
They do.
really all intertwined. So also send me the updated syllabus, because did you take out that second Philip Johnson book?
I did. I took that out the second Philip Johnson. I added the last two parts of the Fountainhead, so I'm going to have them read the whole thing. And then
Okay,
I
sweet.
inserted the architect suicide.
Okay, sweet. And is the suicide over 2 classes or just 1?
2.
2? Cool, cool.
Yeah.
Sweet. And I am looking forward to all of that, and
All
I
right.
will talk to you soon, and I will send you after I figure out what I'm gonna do with this. All
Okay. All right.
right,
Love you. Bye.
all right. Love you too. Bye.